Jennette McCurdy's memoir, I'm Glad My Mum Died, recently just created an absolute storm. It was so popular it sold out after 24 hours. Library queues to get this book were like over 6 months long, and it was so popular that Random House decided to sign her for a 2-book deal worth several $1 million, which includes her debut fiction novel, by the way. It's so popular that my review of this book is my most viewed video. I thought, seeing as so many people are so interested in this memoir, I'm going to recommend 10 other memoirs. 10 memoirs that are so good, the author should also be given a multi-million-dollar deal by Penguin Random House to write fiction. Now, I quite enjoyed McCurdy's memoir, and one of the things that really stood out to me was her writing style. It was wonderfully accessible, yet it was still able to be very emotive and touch on some very dark things. And I just think that, in general, that's what a good memoir needs to do. And when I think about good, accessible writing in the world of fiction, that makes me think of George Orwell, 1984 Animal Farm, that George Orwell. But did you know he wrote a memoir? Actually, he wrote more than one, but we're going to talk about his debut book. Down and Out in Paris and London, for me, is a better representation of Orwell's body of work than his more famous books, Animal Farm and 1984. Orwell went to school at Eton, and then he gained work as a policeman in Burma. But he soon realised that wasn't the profession for him. So aged 24, he left the police force and decided to pursue his dream as a writer. In 1928, Orwell moved to Paris and made friends with several Russians who had moved there following the Russian Revolution. But later, he fell ill and his money was stolen by a young Italian man, leaving him penniless and in a foreign city. Side note, Orwell changed the details of the Italian thief in his memoir to save face with his parents. He later confessed to being robbed by a young woman he was on a misadventure with. Orwell nearly dies of his illness and is forced to seek employment and beg, eventually gaining work as a kitchen hand in a hotel where he slept on the floor and worked 17.5-hour days. He is paid a pittance and he is forced to economise on things like bread. He's working in a kitchen, yet he can't afford bread. There's something really ironic in that. Orwell then moves back to London, but he begins tramping, begging, sleeping in shelters. Through this, he takes the time to discover why the homeless are homeless and explore their resentment to charity, confronting his own bias about the gratitude of the homeless. And he begins to detest the Salvation Army. Orwell is ultimately able to fall back on his private education and wealthy family when he has had enough, and that is a luxury that other people don't have. But his commitment to understanding what it's like when you're down on your luck and communicating that to his audience really should be respected. I think this is a wonderful, empathetic piece of writing that helps you understand how hard the homeless have it then and also still today. Orwell is both able to get you to empathise with individuals inside this book and also to see how the system is broken and works against these people. The stories in this book are not one-off hard luck stories. Now, speaking about a system that works against the people, we're going to talk about Chanel Miller's Know My Name. Chanel Miller was the Jane Doe who was raped and left for dead by Brock Turner. Turner had a promising swimming career ahead of him and only got 3 months for his crime. Everybody who reads this book comments on just how well Miller can write. I know that Miller is writing from the point of view as an activist and a survivor, but I've often said that I hope Miller uses this as a reason to write more, because her story, it is important and compelling, but her writing is so much more than just functional and easy to follow. Miller details her own rape and the events after that, getting examined by the police, and the lead up to the trial. And she goes into some really important issues. She discusses Turner and what she personally wanted out of the trial, which is for Brock Turner to realise what he did, to show her that he has grown and changed, and to give Miller some closure, to sort of let Miller know that given the circumstances, he wouldn't do that again. Essentially, she wants to know that he has learnt his lesson. And I think that this is a really, really very reasonable thing for a victim of crime to want. But ultimately, Brock Turner has to defend himself, and he's not able to give Miller the closure, even if he did grow and change, which it's pretty clear that he didn't. And this sort of brings up what this book really is about. It's not actually about a rape. It is about how the justice system has treated Chanel Miller. It is a critique of it. Miller is arguing for a justice system that places victims at the centre, that looks after victims of crime. A justice system more conscious of the harm that it causes victims and how it can better serve them. When this case did go to trial, Miller's reputation came under attack. Why was what she was wearing on the night and how drunk she was questioned, while Turner's promising swimming career brought up? What about Miller's promising career? What about how much Brock Turner had to drink? I think it's impossible to read this memoir and not feel a combination of just plain sad for Chanel Miller and for all the victims that go through similar sorts of things, but also anger that once the crime is committed, we tend to think that that is the worst aspect, that everything is going to be safe and all right now. And this justice system, it reinforces that the trauma is not over. I thought that this was a wonderfully feminist memoir that focused on trauma and growth. And another memoir that focuses on those two things is The Girl Who Smiled Beads by Clementine Wamaria. Born in Rwanda, Clementine was forced to flee one of the bloodiest and just all-round horrible civil wars that we have ever seen, the Rwandan genocide. Aged just 6, she flees her hometown with her teenage sister, and she travels through several African countries, fearing for her life, fearing for her sister's life, fearing for her safety and her sister's safety. And she talks about being a refugee and how she was treated without an adult to advocate for her or supervise her. Clementine also discusses her relationship with her sister and how this experience affected their relationship. And looking at her sister, the things that a young woman of a certain age might be forced to do to survive, the alliances she decides to make. And it all sort of comes back to Clementine, who is 6 or 9, depending on where you are in the book. The pressure for her to grow up fast. But what this memoir really does is show you that pressure and then continue to remind you just how young she is and how she doesn't understand the reality of the dangers that she is in. Now, eventually Clementine and her sister are able to move to the US and they appear on Oprah. Clementine has begun work as a human rights activist. This is a really horrible memoir that includes war and genocide. Later, Clementine would meet Elie Wiesel and read his memoir Night, saying, "You cannot bear witness on a single word like genocide, yet Night describes exactly what happened to me." Wiesel was born in modern-day Romania in 1928, and his memoir Night is about his time as a Jewish prisoner of war inside the Nazi death camp Auschwitz. The comparison between Wiesel's experience and Clementine's is there to be made, but as memoirs, these are very different books. Wiesel is much more focused on a specific part of the Holocaust and is a harrowing read, detailing how Nazi soldiers would randomly beat him and kill prisoners, how he was weak from malnourishment, and how illness destroyed them. The timeline in this book is really captivating. Wiesel was sent to Auschwitz towards the end of the war with his father. And as we read, we're counting down the days left. You know, and you're sort of asking, what was the date that the Russians took Auschwitz back off the Germans? When did that exactly happen? Was it right at the end? And we know that Wiesel survives this because he wrote a book about it. But we don't know if his father survives. So you're almost just screaming at the characters, just hang in there, not much longer now. But they get closer and closer to death. It's Not something that I should be smiling and joyful about, but it's just such a wonderful book that I can't help it, I'm sorry. Now, I think it's really interesting. This started as a 862-page Yiddish manuscript. When Wiesel first went to publish this, he cut it down to 245 pages, kept it in Yiddish, but published it in Argentina. He then translated it into French and cut it down to a further 178 pages, and then finally translated it into English, where it weighed in at only 116 pages, which makes it a very short read, which I think is actually really good for this type of book. Wiesel is able to give you a personal account of the horrors he faced during the Holocaust, but you don't have to spend a massive amount of time there, which makes it easier to read the horrendous things that happened to him. Wiesel wrote 2 sequels to Night. They're called Day and Dawn. And another memoir that has a lot of sequels is I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. Now, Angelou was a poet, and she was challenged by her friend James Baldwin and her editor Robert Loomis to write an autobiography that was also a work of literature. This takes place between her 3rd and 17th year of life. But it is what happened to Maya when she was 8 that really overwhelms this book. And this book comes with a huge trigger warning: rape of a child. And I came across this quote about the rape in the book. It should be clear, however, that the portrayal of rape is hardly titillating or pornographic. It raises issues of trust, truth, and lies. Love, a child's craving for human contact, language and understanding, and the confusion engendered by the power disparity that necessarily exists between children and adults. I think this quote both demonstrates the wonderful qualities of the book and the attitudes of the time in which it was published. Angelou is able to use this rape to discuss slavery, to challenge the perceptions that African women aren't attractive, but also to show how she has internalized some of these attitudes towards black women. Ultimately, if I was to say this memoir was about one thing, it actually wouldn't be the rape. It would be identity. The identity of a young black woman runs through this. Not the pain they feel or their disadvantages, although that is definitely present, but who they are. And as a white man reading this book, I just thought it was so powerful. But I can imagine a black woman reading this book would just feel seen and understood and would appreciate this book on a whole different level to me. Another memoir in which identity is an important theme is Unicorn by Amaru El-Kadi. Raised in Iraq until they gained admittance to Eton. What is it about Eton? Go to Eton, write a book. Amaru is the child of conservative Muslim parents. Amaru's story is not that of a Muslim suffering from racism as they move to the West, although that is definitely part of the book. It is the story about how they develop a love for marine biology, develop crushes on Macaulay Culkin and the cartoon version of Robin Hood, and how they try to reconcile their identity as a Muslim with their identity as Glamru, a non-binary drag queen who loves 7-inch heels. This is told with a generous amount of both humour and with critical self-reflection. Memoirs often paint the protagonist well for obvious reasons, but Amaru doesn't shy away from their flaws and their misgivings in the past. At the centre of this memoir is Amaru's relationship with their parents, the fights they have, and I think Amaru shows a tremendous amount of empathy for his parents when you consider the mistreatment Amaru received from them. But it is this empathy that means they really do understand where their parents are coming from, and their attempts to love a child and want the best for Amaru. Amaru's mother is such a big character in this. She is so easy to love and hate. She is where Amaru gets their ideas of femininity from. And this relationship is so pivotal to this memoir. Just like another mother-child relationship is in Michelle Zanner's memoir, Crying in H Mart. Coincidentally, Crying in H Mart is also about identity. Growing up as an Asian American, Zanner's mother was Korean, her father American, and This details Xana's time with her mother as she gets diagnosed with a terminal cancer and eventually dies. Xana is obviously exploring the grief around losing one's mother, but she is also in her early 20s. She is meeting her future husband. She's trying to make a career as a musician and is examining just who she is. Having spent her teens pushing away her Korean identity in an attempt to better fit in, she finds herself wanting to embrace it more. And that is despite her only link with it eventually passing away. This is a real grief-filled memoir. If you like reading sad books, you have to read this one. And on top of being a great little memoir, this book taught me a lot about Korea, particularly Korean food and music. And another book to teach me a lot about Korea, albeit a different Korea, is A River in Darkness, One Man's Escape from North Korea by Masaji Ishikawa. A memoir about North Korea, a memoir which details Masaji's escape from a brutal totalitarian country. Masaji's father was a Korean national, married to a Japanese woman and living in Japan when he was persuaded to return to North Korea. As Koreans living in Japan, they were the victims of racism, making it hard to get a job and have a good life. Unfortunately for Masaji, not only was his father lied to about life in North Korea, when he and his family returned to North Korea, they were the victims of racism, being considered Japanese people living in North Korea. This memoir is quite simple but very powerful. It details Masaji's life growing up in Korea and what his day-to-day life looked like as an adult, and then it tells the story of his escape and why they wanted to leave and how he got out. This memoir was just so interesting from beginning to end. We have the politics, we have the realities of his life, and we just have this thrilling finish. While there has been humour present in some of these memoirs, most of them have been about really big, hard-hitting topics, which I think is fitting when we're talking about memoirs that are similar to Jennette McCurdy's memoir, because that was also about big, hard-hitting topics. But McCurdy also had quite a sense of humour in her writing. So I wanted to finish with two memoirs that really blended that sense of humour and those important topics. So I guess in many ways, these are the two books that I recommend the most, if that is the aspect of McCurdy's memoir you enjoyed the most. Betty Gilpin, All the Women in My Brain. Gilpin has such an oddball sense of humour, and it's worth reading the memoir for that alone. Her descriptions of things is always entertaining and just ridiculous. It's not how you describe things, and it's a sense of humour that I particularly enjoy. She describes what life was like growing up with parents who were actors and what she had to do to make it in an industry and how that affected her as a person. I really liked how feminist this memoir was. The title, All the Women in My Brain, is a reference to all the masks she wears, all the different people she can be to get what she wants from the men who run this industry, and how they often want her to be a completely different woman, preferably one who returns their favours with fellatio. Gilpin is the star of the wrestling show Glow, but prior to that she spent years trying to make it as an actor in an industry which really just exploits women through fellatio. And her struggle and the effect on her mental health is quite a dark topic, but Gilpin is able to constantly bring you up with just being a very silly human. This brings me to the last memoir I'm going to recommend, and that is Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. Noah's mother was a black South African, his father was a white one, and at the time that he was born, it was illegal to have such a union. Noah's skin is very light, so being raised by his mother in a black community in a segregated country, he was often called the white boy, and he never really belonged anywhere. You know, around white kids he was black, around black kids he was white. Noah details so many different stories of what life was like in South Africa and the racism in the community. And I really like how he does it with this great blend of humour and empathy. I really enjoyed the explanation of why Hitler is such a common name for black kids in South Africa. Black South Africans don't know European history as well as most Westerners. And the common belief was that Hitler, he was such a badass guy. He was the guy that all the white people were scared of. So instantly he became a hero amongst black people. This obviously creates tension between black people and South African Jews. And the story that Noah tells about this is just great. I think it is such a wonderful demonstration of how ridiculous racism is. It really points out that nobody is considering anybody else. Everybody is feeling attacked and things get escalated so quickly. Yet the whole thing, it would just be so funny if it wasn't horrible. Do you know, like, Noah is such a fantastic storyteller, combining his skills as a stand-up comic with some really harrowing details about what life was like with his very religious mother in a very racist society which was rapidly changing. And it ends with quite a scary story about his mother, which I won't go into any details of. But I just want to say, like, he's so feminist, and it's just because Noah loves his mum and tries to understand her values and her situations and her reality, and just sees her as an individual human being. And it's just lovely to see that relationship exist in this book as well. This is just a remarkable book, and it's a perfect book to conclude my recommendations. If you liked Jennette McCurdy's memoir, I'm Glad My Mum Died, click here to watch my review of the book. Bye bye.